Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. I hope that everyone can see the images, because what I've decided to do is to give a short paper that I'm going to read, although it's basically a summary, I think, of the more important things in the book, and it's accompanied by a number of images, so I'll try to make it as interesting as I can, so that it's not too dull just to hear me read the paper. But I would like to begin by emphasizing there are two main theses to this book. The first one is that the origin of the term yellow is much more recent than people seem to imagine. It's something that does not come about until the very end of the 18th century. And the second thesis is that we are not going to find the source of yellowness by looking at descriptions of East Asian people. By looking at descriptions of East Asian people, we do not find the term yellow until quite late, because the source of this term comes from somewhere else. It actually comes from science. And so this book is largely about the history of science, more so than the history of travel literature or the history of East-West contact, eyewitness contact. So I want to begin by remarking that when I first came to this project, I wondered whether yellow originated in some kind of misunderstanding of yellow in the Chinese tradition. As we all know, in China, in the Chinese tradition, yellow is the central color. It's the imperial color, the color of the earth, the color of the Yellow River, and it's also related to the Yellow Emperor. So I wondered, could it be that some Western missionary or Western traveler heard about this detail, perhaps before the 18th century, and he applied it as a description of the country as a whole? He called it perhaps the land of people who prized yellow, the yellow people. To my surprise, however, I have been unable to find a single example of such a link before the end of the 18th century. So it is not true that the term yellow comes from the Chinese tradition, or some misunderstanding of the Chinese tradition. In fact, whenever a Westerner describes yellow in Chinese culture, he or she never connects it to the people, and never connects it to the idea that the people have yellow skin. In terms of appearance, whenever the color of East Asian people is mentioned, they are described most often as white people. And I quote, "as white as we are." So where does yellow come from? If we look at a long line of travel, missionary, merchant reports, in fact, we find a wide variety of color terms in different European languages. When Western travelers first came to Asia, they were pleased and gratified to find that the people were not dark or black, but there was no consensus about what they should be called. By 1600, and this is a short list, Chinese people had been described as brown, red, tawny, black, swarthy, dun, tanned, ashy, sanguine, olive, brunette, ruddy, and florid. And these are only the terms in English. Where does yellow come from? We're not going to find a satisfactory answer by looking in travel texts, because the adoption of any color term is a symptom of a larger development within racialized thinking. To call East Asians yellow, in other words, was a means of ensuring that while they may not be as dark as Africans, they could no longer be considered white. I think that's the key here. Maybe they're not yellow, but they're not white. Therefore, a new color had to be found for them. What do we call them? Just as all the other human groups were being pigeonholed according to new scientific conceptions of heritage and biological descent, it is from the world of science that a more satisfying answer might be found. Example of one anthropologist in 1933 who actually tried to organize eye folds according to ethnic group. So you have a Mongolian fold, you have a Negro fold, you have other kinds of fold. There's an American Indian fold. It's very, very tiny. It's hard for you to see. But my point is that you take this perceived defect and you racialize it. You put it into racial groups. And this is one effect of racial thinking. The second example, Mongolian spot, was also for the 19th century medical world a tremendous discovery. They had no idea that some children are born with spots on their backs. And so it was called the Mongolian spot because, once again, it was a marker of someone who wasn't white, someone who was Mongolian, from the Mongolian race. Okay, I think we'll skip over the great details of this. Again, it was used as a pretext to separate people from white people, in this case East Asians, even though the spot is not a feature of East Asians only. It was once again assumed to be a marker of the non-white race. The last example is Mongolism, which was discovered in the mid-19th century. It was discovered by a doctor called John Langdon Down. That's why it's called Down syndrome today. He suggested that you could divide patients into an ethnic classification, even though all of his patients were white. Because, he said, mental retardation creates children who look like other races. And one of these races, he said, is the Mongolian race. And that's how the term Mongolism was invented. And he said, isn't it amazing how these children look like brothers? But in fact, they're children of completely different families. And he also said, isn't it amazing how they look like Mongolians? Meaning East Asians. So there's this idea that, once again, that a child with mental retardation will be like a lower race. He's no longer a white child, he's dropped to a lower race, like the yellow race. So all of these are very unpleasant, very offensive racializations. But one important aspect was that he said that Mongoloid children have yellow skin, just like real Mongolians. The most shocking development of this was a man called Cruikshank, who wrote a very famous book in his time called The Mongol in Our Midst, 1924. And what he does, this is really incredible, he compares a girl with Down syndrome to an actual Mongolian girl. And he says, don't they look similar? A mentally retarded girl and a real Mongolian girl. Here we have a man with Down syndrome and a man from Central Asia. And he said, don't they look the same? And this book was like a bestseller in 1924. People were crazy about this. They thought it was so fantastic and interesting. But even worse, he also claimed that there was a parallel between the three kinds of apes. We have three kinds of people, white, black, and yellow. We have three kinds of ape, chimpanzee, orangutan, and I can't remember the third one, forgive me. In any case, it's not as important as that he claims that a child with Down syndrome, an East Asian person, in this case a Buddhist monk, and an orangutan all sit in the same way. And therefore, there must be a relationship between them. So again, it's this example of, you single out this idea of the Mongolian, which is also yellow, and you try to relate it to a variety of other aspects of science in order to prove something. I'm not really sure what this proves. But again, it was a very interesting and remarkably late example. This is 1924.
I actually do have one question related to the talk, and then surely if I could, I'll wrap up the thing in the end. But the question is actually very simple. It's about the comparison. You talked about yellowness, And as you pointed out, the whole idea of yellowness was created at the same time when Negroness or blackness was invented.
Right.
So what's the Negro story, in a way? And how does that,
very good question.
Yeah.
Actually, the black race is not really the best parallel. The best parallel is the red race. Because in the Western tradition, the difference between white and black is very old. It goes back to the beginning of the Christian era and before. The idea that Europeans are white and other people are black. I mean, it's in the Bible, the Song of Songs, the woman who says, "I'm black but comely." I mean, there's blackness as a more negative attribute is a very ancient idea in the Western tradition. But redness, Native Americans, American Indians, that's also a fictional color. Nobody's really red either. That is born at about the same time as yellowness. But to give you perhaps a final example, but in the American Indian example, some tribes were thought to apply things to their skin for the protection of the sun or from insects, which might have given their skin a kind of reddish color, so that the colonizers who came to America may have sort of mistaken their color and thought they were red. And secondly, many Native American tribes began to refer to themselves as red, even in the 17th century, to differentiate themselves from the white settlers and from their African slaves. But, and this is an example of how incredibly strange yellow is, yellow has no such excuse. Nobody applied something yellow to their skin that could be mistaken for yellow, right? Asians didn't describe themselves as yellow until very recently. So redness is the better parallel. But even red has a kind of reason. Yellow has no reason, as far as I can tell. So it adds to the mystery of where this comes from.
Thanks.
It's a good question.